Hey y'all, so I am back with another tip for founders that are getting ready to do fundraising or have already done some fundraising related to internal governance and structuring of the company. So if you remember, in the last video, we talked about how to properly call a meeting, and in this video, I'm going to talk about how to properly run a meeting, which is the next step after you've called it properly. Running a meeting and the manner in which a meeting is run is extremely important, not only for efficiency and logistics purposes, but also for legality purposes and ensuring everything is happening that needs to happen and is running smoothly. So before we get there, I do want to make a couple of notes that were mentioned in the previous video, but also should still be considered now as we talk about this topic, and that is ensuring that everyone who has the right to be present at or voting at a meeting is has been given notice and is in attendance at the meeting. This is extremely important. If you'll check either your internal operating agreements, because remember that's the document that we're referencing for this series of videos, or your relevant state business organizations code. If you don't have internal operating documents, that may be taking the place of your internal documents. So referencing those to see two things. One, what actions are you taking? And within those documents or that code, what groups of individuals have the right to vote on that sort of thing? So for example, if you're in Texas and you're operating under the business code because you don't have your own internal operating agreement, there are certain types of actions that all owners of the company, if you're an LLC, that would be your members. If you're a corporation, that would be your stockholders or shareholders. They are entitled to vote on certain types of actions, generally known as fundamental business transactions. Then you have other decisions, for example, your day-to-day operational decisions. And I don't necessarily mean, paying your water bill or paying your light bill or something along those lines. I mean hiring or firing of an officer, making the decision to enter into a lease, all of those sorts of things. So what type of action are you planning to take at the meeting? And based on recognizing what type of action you're taking and referencing either the code or your internal organizational documents, who has a right to be present and to be voting on those issues. So you need to be referencing those. Let's assume that all of those people are in attendance at the meeting or at least have been given proper notice. Now the question is, we're all sitting there, what do we do? And there are a couple things to keep in mind when it comes to running either board meeting, manager, board meetings, member meetings, shareholder meetings, any of that sort of stuff. You need to understand the rules by which the meeting is supposed to be run. And once again, this varies wildly and can vary wildly based on your internal operating documents. Some documents provide for specific officers for a meeting that have already been laid out. For example, your internal operating documents may say, okay, if we're having a meeting of the managers of an LLC, then that meeting needs to be run by the chairperson. The chairperson is X, Y, and Z person. Sometimes it'll name a person, sometimes it won't. If it says we need a chairperson, a vice chair, and a secretary, before you can effectively run a meeting, a later meeting to make some sort of decision, those people need to be properly elected under the rules or appointed. So we want to make sure that all of our officers, as required to properly hold that meeting and document that meeting, have been properly elected into their positions. All of the information for doing that should be laid out in your internal operating documents. If it's not, then ensuring that the meeting has someone to be in charge of it. What does that mean? It means having an agenda. So making sure that you have specific actions that are supposed to be covered in the meeting, and you have a list of what those are and what procedures are required to facilitate those actions. It's extremely important that you do not change the agenda once you have entered the meeting. The reason for that being that, just as we talked about last time, you may be required to give notice to different groups of people or different types of notice or different time periods of notice based on what's being discussed in the meeting. Just because you called a meeting to vote on signing a new lease for the company maybe that requires one sort of vote and one sort of approval and one sort of notice. But if we get into the meeting and suddenly we want to discuss an investment offer that we got from X, Y, and Z company, we can't discuss that or at least take action on that in the same meeting. Why? Like I said, because there may be procedural technicalities that were not followed to take that specific type of action. So it's very important that you've decided on the agenda ahead of time and that you don't deviate from the actions specified on that agenda unexpectedly. So you want to make sure not only that you have your agenda, but you fully understand what procedures need to take place in order for each of those actions to be effectuated. Does it require debate? How much of a vote does it require? Sometimes decisions only require a majority of the present voting. Sometimes it requires, 3/4. Sometimes it just varies depending on what your internal operating agreement says, and if it's silent on that, then what the business organizations code says. Once again, why does all of this kind of stuff matter? And honestly, we could talk for 15 minutes about just high-level procedural technicalities that you'll want to be aware of. These are just really providing an example of some of the things you want to be aware of. Just like last week, why does this matter? Because, once again, all of these things, all of these technicalities are important for ensuring that the action taken by the company is valid and can be enforced by the company later on. The company can be bound to it later on, and in the event that someone's unhappy with the decision that's been made, that they feel or are aware that proper procedures have been followed, otherwise that action could be challenged. Along these same lines, I would be remiss if I did not mention in this video that you also need to be sure to keep notes for all of this. Even if you don't have an official secretary, you should have some documentation of the meeting or the decisions being made, the actions being taken, who all agrees to it, who does not, what your reasoning for all of that is. That's extremely important, and that's one of the things, even if, while I don't recommend it, even if you ignored the rest of the procedural technicalities, those minutes are extremely important for various reasons. One, you need to know who was present and who voted for and against it in the event that someone needs to be held responsible for that decision later on. Two, it's important to include things like the reason. What is the reason or the debate, the conversation that happened surrounding those issues? Why is that important? Because you as a manager, a shareholder, an officer of an LLC, a company, whatever, or corporation, whatever the situation may be, are held to certain fiduciary duties. So if you act against certain interests of the company, you may potentially be held personally responsible for those decisions. And so having an understanding of why you reached that decision, what your justifications were, what interest or purpose it was serving for the business is extremely important. And the third reason those are extremely important is because, once again, if you make a decision that someone later on disagrees with, it will only benefit you to have a record of how that decision was made, who participated in it, to either validate that decision or provide additional information for someone who may later on disagree. It helps to decrease potential personal liability or personal responsibility for your managers, your board, your officers, potentially even your shareholders or stakeholders. So all of that stuff is important to keep in mind in terms of running a meeting. There are a number of procedural rules or structures that you can follow to run a specific board meeting. I have people ask all the time, do I have to use Robert's Rules of Order? Not necessarily, unless your your internal operating agreements specifically require you to use Robert's Rules of Order. You do have some flexibility, but just keeping in mind that there needs to be consistency. People need to be aware of what the agenda is and what's going to be addressed going on, and that everyone has a fair or equal opportunity to be heard, to participate in the conversation, and that we have great records memorializing everything that's done. That will help to decrease liability in the long term. It will help provide documentation for major decisions in the event something happens with the business where people maybe disagree, want to exit. Even investors like to see additional documentation on certain things. So it's always great to have documentation, and hopefully this gives you a little bit more tangible resources and things to keep in mind